Okay, in the last video we talked about how lipids were broken down in the digestive system by lipase with some help with emulsification by bile, and how they are absorbed into the cell and placed on chylomicrons with some lipoproteins and moved into the bloodstream through the lymphatic system, and how the liver processes them and makes LDLs and VLDLs and HDLs. But what happens once those lipids get to your cells? Well, we've talked about how lipids store energy very effectively. But how do we burn them? Well, it's not that difficult. Once you understand how glucose is metabolized, right? Glycolysis and the citric acid cycle and the electron transport chain, lipids can jump right in there essentially. Lipolysis, so the breaking down of lipids, includes the breakdown of these triglycerides, this is the fats that we're talking about, into a glycerol and 3 fatty acids. Well, let's start with the glycerol first. That glycerol is very much like pyruvate, and it only takes a little tweak to turn that glycerol into pyruvate. And if you remember, pyruvate's what we get at the end of glycolysis. And so it's easy to just slide that right into the rest of that catabolic pathway that we talked about. We can break off a carbon, make it acetyl-CoA, send it into the citric acid cycle, etc., etc. Then we have 3 fatty acids. Well, fatty acids are essentially just long chains of carbons. Well, if we break those off 2 at a time, those 2 carbon molecules are acetyl groups. We can bind them to coenzyme A, and that's acetyl-CoA, and it goes right into the citric acid cycle. This process of breaking down these fatty acids 2 carbons at a time is called beta oxidation, and you can get a lot of energy from this. So again, we break our glycerol off from our triglyceride, turn it into pyruvate, jumps right into this catabolic process. Our fatty acids, we break down 2 carbons at a time, and we make acetyl groups, join with coenzyme A, and jump into the citric acid cycle. In addition to breaking down triglycerides and fatty acids into the components that fit within that glucose catabolism that we talked about, like pyruvate and acetyl-CoA, we can also use those ingredients to build up new lipids. So we said a glycerol is easy to turn into a pyruvate. Well, pyruvate's easy to turn back into a glycerol. We said that you can break down fatty acids into acetyl groups. Well, you can put acetyl groups together to form most fatty acids. Now, not all. There are some fatty acids that we cannot produce from other ingredients. Right? Those are called essential fatty acids. Whenever you see an essential nutrient, that means it's a nutrient that we can't make. It has to be eaten by us. So things like omega-3s and omega-6s, which you've probably heard of, these are essential fatty acids. The rest we can make. In fact, most of the acids of the lipids that you have, the fats, come when we have too much sugar. Right? When we have too much blood sugar, we turn those glycerols, those pyruvates into glycerols, and we turn those acetyl groups into fatty acids, and we build our own triglycerides, which we then store. This is why, even if you eat very little fat, but you eat spoonfuls of sugar constantly, you're going to end up with a lot of fat. Right? When it comes to energy storage, lipids are actually way more useful than carbohydrates because they store a lot more energy in a much smaller package. So why don't we just use lipids for everything? Well, they can't provide a large amount of ATP quickly because a lot of the enzymes that we use are water soluble and they can't metabolize fats very quickly at all. So glucose is still our primary fuel, but in terms of long-term energy storage, lipids are incredibly useful. Okay, now let's discuss protein digestion. So we've talked about carbohydrates and lipids. Protein digestion starts mechanically in your mouth as well, right? You take a big bite of that hamburger or that steak if you're feeling fancy, and you chew it up in your mouth. But we don't chemically begin breaking down these proteins until you get to your stomach. And if you recall from last semester, proteins are long chains of amino acids. They are polypeptides, amino acids held together by peptide bonds. And in the stomach, you produce an enzyme called pepsin. Really, you produce it as pepsinogen, which is a precursor, turns into pepsin when it hits the acid. And that pepsin breaks peptide bonds and takes long polypeptides like proteins and breaks them into smaller and smaller polypeptide chains. Then in the duodenum, you continue with protein digestion because your pancreas also produces proteases. Specifically, something called trypsinogen, which becomes trypsin, just like pepsinogen becomes pepsin. Right? Trypsinogen is the precursor form. Trypsin is the active conformation of that protein. And that breaks down other enzymes. You also have an enzyme called chymotrypsin, and there are a few others, but we'll focus on trypsin and chymotrypsin as the main pancreatic proteases, or protein breaking down enzymes. Then at the very end, right, as those peptidases have been breaking these long chains of polypeptides into smaller and smaller and smaller polypeptides, we end up with these dipeptides. So just like we ended up with disaccharides, and then we had brush border enzymes to break those last two apart into monosaccharides that we could absorb, we have dipeptides, and we have brush border enzymes that are going to break those dipeptides apart into individual amino acids, which we can then absorb. And this is, again, a nice summary figure anatomically of where that happened. These proteins are now broken down into amino acids, and those amino acids are then absorbed through facilitated diffusion and also some co-transport, so we do spend some ATP to do this, into the cells that line your small intestines, and then out of those cells onto the other side in that interstitial fluid, in that intestinal villus, where they can be picked up by blood capillaries and transported, you guessed it, to the liver through that hepatic portal system. And the liver is going to process some of this stuff. Your liver makes all of your blood proteins, so it's going to use some of those amino acids to build blood proteins like albumin, things like that. And a lot of those amino acids are just going to stay in your blood, and they're going to end up going through your circulatory system to all the other cells in your body so that you can use them to make proteins there. And this is a nice summary figure of what happens with your amino acids. Your liver can produce half of the amino acids that you need. There are 20 total amino acids that we have inside of us, and 10 of them your liver cells can produce from other ingredients. Sort of like the lipid production that we just talked about. The other 10 are called essential amino acids. Again, essential nutrients are nutrients that we cannot build on our own, and so the only way we can get them is by eating them. This is important. So, for instance, good protein sources can be animal products often, things like meat or eggs, stuff like that. So if you are a vegetarian or a vegan, you can certainly get all of your essential amino acids, but you have to pay a little bit more attention to how you do it. So, when I was in college and my friends and I were all, becoming burgeoning environmentalists and vegetarians, my way of doing that was just eating nothing but macaroni and cheese, right? It turns out that while macaroni and cheese is delicious, it does not have all of your essential amino acids, and it is not very helpful. Right? There we go. Breaking down amino acids is also possible, right? If you need to burn proteins for ATP, you can do it, right? We prefer glucose and lipids, but you can do it with proteins if necessary. But first you have to deaminate your amino acids, meaning you have to take that amino group off, that NH2. That usually turns into an ammonium. Now, ammonium is toxic, so we tend to turn it into urea in the liver. And then urea is less toxic, but we still want to get rid of it, and that's what we filter out. One of the things that we filter out. If you just ate lunch, then you are probably in an absorptive state. That means that your stomach is full, and you're releasing food into your small intestines, and you are absorbing food. And this will happen for several hours after you eat, because the food sticks around in your stomach. Your stomach releases it just a little bit at a time into your small intestines. And in an absorptive state, this is like payday. You build and you store, right? When it's payday, I spend that money on the things that I need, and if I have extra money, I put it in storage, right? When you are in an absorptive state, your cells are going to take up glucose, You're also going to produce glycogen for storage, right? Because of insulin. Insulin helps this process out. You are going to build proteins because you've got lots of amino acids. You are going to build fats because you have lots of them and you probably need to store them, or you've been eating lots of sugar and you need to store that extra energy as fats. You're also going to be building ATPs, right, to do the things that you need, but you probably have more food than you need ATP, and so you're going to store some of that. So again, absorptive state, we are building. We are building triglycerides, we are building glycogen, we are building proteins, right? And insulin is what triggers this all. So once your blood sugar spikes after you eat, insulin causes you to do these things. Several hours later, when your stomach is empty and you're not absorbing anything anymore, you are in a post-absorptive state. Now, it's not payday anymore, right? It's been a couple of weeks, and your body needs to rely on those things that you built before, those reserves. So your blood sugar is low, which means, as we talked about several chapters ago, you are going to be secreting things like glucagon. And glucagon is going to cause you to break down your glycogen into glucose. It also is going to cause you to burn through lipids, right? Lipolysis. So we are going to break down those lipids through beta oxidation, like we talked about before. We may even burn amino acids if we have to. Now, the more lipids and proteins that you break down, the more ketone bodies that you make, right? And these ketone bodies wind up in your blood, and they're acidic, and you can go into ketoacidosis. The keto diet is all about this, right? So this is our post-absorptive state. We are not building, we are breaking down. We are using our savings. We're breaking down triglycerides to make ATP. We're breaking down glycogen to make glucose to make ATP. And we may even be breaking down proteins if necessary. The nutrients that we need a lot of, we call macronutrients, and that is carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, to a lesser extent, nucleic acids. But just because we need less of something doesn't make it any less necessary, right? And so micronutrients, things that we definitely need, but we need in much smaller amounts, include things like vitamins and minerals. Vitamins are organic macronutrients, meaning they are things that are made by living organisms. They can be fat-soluble or water-soluble. We'll talk about that in a moment. Minerals or inorganic nutrients that we need just a little bit of. So things like sodium and calcium and potassium and iron and those sorts of things. Those are just elements, right? They don't have to be made by a living organism, but we do need them as nutrients. So vitamins, organic micronutrients, include fat-soluble vitamins. These you cannot absorb without fats. So one example of this is vitamin D. So my wife likes skim milk, and one of the benefits of having a small child is that we have whole milk around all the time, which I love. And I tell my wife all the time, it's great, because if we want to take in that vitamin D, you need to be eating lipids at the same time to do that. Now, these get stored in lipid deposits, and so you don't run out of them as quickly, right? Because even if you haven't had vitamin D recently, if you burn some fat that has vitamin D in it, you release some vitamin D into your body. A, E, K, these are all fat-soluble vitamins. Water-soluble vitamins are much easier to absorb because they come in with the water that your digestive system is filled with all the time. So these are going to be those B vitamins that we talk about a lot, and vitamin C, and these tend to come and go pretty quickly. If you have excess, they go in your urine, right? So we've all probably eaten a multivitamin, and then you find out a few hours later that your urine is neon. This is how. But we get rid of them quickly. They don't store up in lipid reserves, so you have to keep consuming them over and over and over again. B12 in particular is important because it binds to intrinsic factor in order to be absorbed. And where is intrinsic factor made? The stomach, right? So we cannot absorb B12 without intrinsic factor from the stomach.